All right, everyone, it looks like we're at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank everyone for being here and welcome you to the Guava and Osterman Research webinar today on best practices for social media archiving and security. My name is Q Mangus. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Guava, and I will be hosting this webinar today. We have a number of people on the call, and we're grateful that you could be here. We're also pleased to bring you Michael Osterman from Osterman Research. Michael will be presenting the social media security and archiving presentation here. Just so everyone is aware, Michael is an industry expert and is the president and founder of Osterman Research. He has over 27 years of experience in the high-tech research industry and has spent over 16 of those years following specifically the messaging collaboration industries. One thing to take note of before we start is that we will have some time at the end of this webinar to have some Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to put those through in the chat there that you see in the webinar software in the Adobe Connect. Put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll make sure to get to those at the end of the presentation. So once again, thanks everyone for being here and for your interest in this topic, and we'll go ahead and give the time over to Michael. Michael, go ahead and take it away.
Well, Q, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everybody who's here with us today. Let's get started. Just a little bit of background about Osterman Research so that you understand our perspective on this topic. As Q mentioned, we're an independent market research and consulting firm, and our focus really is on the way that people communicate or collaborate in a workplace context. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research. We'll be going through a bit of that here today. The company's about 15 years old, and we're based near Seattle. So, let's get right into it. We all know that consumer social media is pervasive. The vast majority of us use Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, WhatsApp, just a really wide variety of social media tools. And these are really useful things. We find, great utility in finding Facebook in using Facebook for keeping up with friends and family, using LinkedIn to keep up with business contacts, using Twitter to share information, to gather information from industry experts and so forth. And all of these tools have a tremendous amount of utility for us personally and also in the workplace. As you can see here, just from these numbers from a few months ago, there are literally hundreds of millions of users of these tools around the world, and their use continues to grow over time. What we also find, though, and this came from a recent survey that we did in support of the white paper you can download, is that the use of consumer social media in a business context is really quite common, and it's on the increase. We see a lot of brands, a lot of companies, and so forth that will set up a Facebook page, that will have a Twitter feed, that will use LinkedIn in a variety of ways, as well as a variety of other social media tools. And they're finding tremendous utility in these. Being able to talk about a brand, have more, control over the message than you might necessarily get even with a website. So there are lots of advantages to the use of social media personally, but increasingly in a business context. And that's really what we're here to discuss today. How are these social media tools used in business, and what are the threats that they present to your organization if they are not managed properly? What we also find is that corporate social media is also very widely used. Now, we include Microsoft SharePoint here. It's not truly a social media tool per se, although it does have social media elements to it. It's mainly for document collaboration, document sharing, and so forth. But we've included it here because SharePoint is so incredibly pervasive in most organizations. Now, again, it's not used primarily as a social media property, but it is used to some extent in the social media realm. But then there are also a variety of Cisco social platforms like WebEx, WebEx Social. Microsoft is pushing hard on Yammer, and it's gaining traction in a lot of organizations. There's Salesforce Chatter, IBM Connections, Atlassian, Jive, lots and lots of other enterprise social media tools. And we'll get into here in just a bit the reasons for that and the utility that they can provide and so forth. But bottom line here is that the use of corporate social media is on the increase, just like it is with consumer or public social media. And the implications of that really are quite important, both from the perspective of the security of the information that employees are sharing with others, that they're sharing internally, that they're gathering from social media, as well as the content retention, the need to preserve content that you're sharing in social media, that you're capturing, that you're generating, and so forth. So again, a lot of implications for both social media in the context of true enterprise-grade social media, as you see here, as well as the whole slew of about 1,000 other, literally about 1,000 other consumer social media properties. So social media's entry into the workplace really has had a couple of different drivers depending upon the type of social media we're talking about. If we're looking at consumer tools like Facebook and so forth, these are really driven primarily by employees. Employees set up their own personal Facebook account, for example, and then they use it for personal applications, of course, but then they also start using it for work, to find out about people, to share information about the company, to distribute content, what have you. And again, there are lots and lots of major brands as well as lots of minor ones that have employed Facebook and other types of social media tools used in the consumer realm to share information about their company. And again, these are used mainly for personal reasons at first, and then later there are adaptations so that employees can carry out various job functions. Twitter, for example, is can be considered a business tool, but for all intents and purposes, it's really a public / consumer-oriented social media tool, yet it's very useful for getting information out about a company, becoming a sort of an established guru in a space, and so forth. Also, these tools are used to a large extent for customer service, for marketing, and really related types of applications. For example, lots of airlines will use social media. Lots of different brands will use social media to be able to respond to customer complaints, customer inquiries, and so forth. And social media is a very effective tool basically to ward off a lot of the bad stuff that could happen. For example, if you have a bad experience with an airline and you tweet about it, an organization can sort of head that off at the pass by using social media. I fly Alaska Airlines primarily being based here in Seattle, and I have found, for example, that anytime I tweet about Alaska Airlines, they will respond in 2 to 3 minutes. So whether I have a compliment or a complaint, they are very quick to respond to it and basically address the issue before it can get out of hand. Now, from a corporate perspective, when we're talking about enterprise social media, the drivers really tend to be much more formal. The reasons for implementing enterprise social media need to be fairly carefully considered. You're going to be making a major investment in a new platform, that integrates with email, that integrates maybe with CRM, that integrates really with a wide variety of other tools that you've already deployed in the organization. And so you need to be very careful, very circumspect about the kind of social media that you're implementing. And you have to have pretty good reasons for doing it. It's not just so that you can address a point problem, but it's so that you can address your communications issues, collaboration issues, decision-making, and so forth. Typically, the deployment of a corporate or an enterprise social media platform is initiated by IT, unlike the consumer variety that tends to be implemented only by employees. And typically, you're going to implement some sort of a corporate or enterprise social media platform so that you can improve the quality of your communications, improve the agility of your organization, maybe address the volume of communications. A lot of organizations, for example, are starting to adopt enterprise social media because they don't want to rely on email as a file sharing or collaboration tool. And while email continues to dominate communications and collaboration in most organizations, it's really not a tremendously efficient way to share information. When you're using email, for example, for collaboration purposes, you can have version control issues, you can have timing issues, issues of non-deliverability, and so forth. So a lot of organizations have adopted enterprise social media really to get around a lot of the problems they have today with using email as a communications and collaborations tool. So from a recent survey we did on enterprise social media, what we found is that organizations really are looking at really a wide variety of things to justify the deployment of enterprise social media. What we found, for example, is that about 2/3 of organizations are looking to enterprise social media to improve their communication or collaboration processes between the various work groups, departments, functions, and so forth within the company. Nearly as many are looking to establish more communication between those groups so that those groups aren't operating just as isolated islands or silos of information and work, but so that they can integrate better with one another and share information more effectively and really become a more effective organization. We found that nearly half are looking to improve communication or collaboration across geographies. This is a critical issue that enterprise social media can address very nicely because now you can have real-time communications, real-time file sharing, and so forth between groups that may be all over the globe. A lot of organizations are looking to use corporate social media to more effectively share best practices across the organization. What we find is that a lot of organizations will develop a best practice in one work group or one geography, but that somehow doesn't get shared across the entire organization. If you have good enterprise social media capabilities, you can more effectively do that and really share these best practices across the organization. And then there are just a lot of other reasons to implement enterprise social media to help employees find expertise across the organization, to reduce email volume, maybe to resolve customer issues more quickly. And this is going to be dependent to a large extent on the corporate culture within the organization, how people share information, why they want to share information, if they want to do so at all, and so forth. But there are lots of really good reasons for organizations to implement good enterprise social media. So, looking at social media, excuse me, it really is sort of a double-edged sword in many ways. Social media has a number of important benefits associated with it. You can dramatically improve communication and collaboration, and this includes consumer social media as well, not just enterprise social media. You can make decisions faster because now you have access to more information, potentially better information. You can communicate with people in real time instead of sending off an email and waiting a couple of hours for a response. You have better information sharing because now you can collaborate, for example, on the same file, look at the same images, have shared whiteboard meetings and so forth in a very impromptu way. You have easier discovery of corporate expertise, and this is one of the real advantages of a true enterprise social media platform because there are pockets of expertise all over an organization. And typically, these are not advertised very well. You may know that somebody worked at a company you're interested in dealing with, or somebody may have been the CMO at a competitor. Whatever the case may be, it's important to be able to share this information. And in the absence of a good enterprise social media tool, there really aren't many good ways to gain access to all of that expertise and distribute it across the organization. So this is really one of the primary benefits of enterprise social media, being able to really tap into all of that expertise around the organization. And finally, just to improve customer communications and insight, just to learn more about customers, to learn more about your own company, about the people within it, and so forth. The problem, though, is that social media, both consumer and enterprise social media, it really increases the likelihood of malicious content entering an organization, particularly on the consumer social side, where malware can very easily enter through something like a Facebook ad, a short URL in Twitter, what have you. There's also a greater likelihood of data breaches because now it's so easy to share information, and as we'll get into here in just a bit, it's very easy to share information inadvertently. You can be sharing information that you don't even know is being sent, so that can increase the likelihood of a data breach. And finally, there are greater risks of inadequate retention of business records. And as social media is used more, both on the consumer side and for enterprise social media, you are going to be storing business records in that. You're going to be generating and sharing information that you need to retain for a long period. And as we'll get into here in just a bit, the vast majority of organizations today are not doing that, and they're putting themselves at risk as a result. So getting into some of the threats posed by social media. A lot of organizations, we found in our research, and this is from a recent research project, a lot of organizations don't have any written policies about the use of various types of social media currently used in their organization or that might potentially be used in the future. For example, we found that only 51% of organizations currently have any sort of written policy about the use of social media. And so, following on with the BYO or bring your own phenomenon that we see with devices like mobile devices and cloud applications and so forth, social media is pretty much a wide open field. Individuals, for the most part, can use just about any social media property they want, and there's no corporate policy to tell them they can't do it, or to tell them how to do it, or to use only specific features and not others. We also found in the survey project, that only 48% of organizations have a policy about the use of consumer social networks when they're used for work purposes. So if somebody wants to use Facebook to share information about the company, to tweet a new product announcement, a new press release, what have you, fewer than 1/2 of the organizations we surveyed have any sort of a policy that dictates how you might use those consumer social media properties to do that. We also find that data can be leaked through social media channels fairly easily. There can be overt leaks, such as sharing an embargoed press release too early. And we see that periodically in the trade press. You might see it in a Twitter feed, for example, that somebody has shared information maybe 12 hours or a day or a couple of days too early in advance maybe of a major conference. And most often these are just mistakes. People maybe queue up something in their Twitter feed and send it too early. Something of that nature. But you can have more subtle leaks as well. For example, as we'll get into here in just a bit, geolocation is a major threat in the context of social media use because it can reveal information about your company and about your plans without you even realizing it. And also there have been cases where trade secrets have been lost. We have a few examples of that, but suffice it to say that you can potentially lose trade secrets through social media simply, through accidental sharing of information, sharing of findings and so forth that can potentially result in the loss of intellectual property or other types of trade secrets. And then there are other problems. Social media makes it quite easy for employees to share offensive jokes, racially insensitive, sexually offensive jokes, and so forth. And while you can do that in email and other forms of communication, social media makes it very immediate. When you share something to your Twitter followers, when you post it to Facebook, that's immediately known pretty much worldwide to potentially thousands or tens of thousands of people. And if that content gets shared, it can all be tied back to an individual or your company. And the threat of social media as well is that even if somebody is operating, for example, a Facebook or Twitter account totally personally without posting corporate information, if they are closely aligned with that company in the minds of most people that are reading that information, then most people are going to view the individual and the company as one and the same. And if there is a sexually offensive joke, if there's a racially offensive joke, that's going to fall back on the company to some extent, even if it's inadvertent, even if people don't mean to make that link or that tie-in, they'll do so anyway. That can be a real problem for employers. And also, there have been a number of cases where individuals on Twitter or Facebook have discussed their company or they've discussed their clients inappropriately. If you want to prove that to yourself, just go to Twitter and type in "my client is stupid," and you'll get a whole slew of posts from individuals within companies that are talking about their clients in very inappropriate ways. My favorite from a couple of years ago is a woman who shared information, something to the effect that, I love when my boss gets drunk at 8:30 at night, and then she posted a short URL with a map to the company. For whatever reason, she did that. I have no idea, but people do that periodically, and it can be very damaging to an employer when they do so. Also, social media contains business records, but as I mentioned earlier, most organizations really are not properly archiving that content. We found, for example, that 2/3 of organizations are not archiving content from their external social networks, and 43% that have deployed an enterprise social platform aren't doing that either. So we find a lot of organizations that are generating business records in the context of social media. They're saving that information maybe on a desktop somewhere or in a personal social media account, but that information is not being archived, and a lot of it has to be. For example, if you're sharing information about a press release, if you're sharing information about a company, talking about a new announcement, whatever the case may be, in many instances, that is considered a business record. Just like you would send it an email and you have to retain it for a certain length of time, the same applies to social media. Now, some industries have codified this very well. The financial services industry, for example, through FINRA, has established a set of rules about what you need to do in preserving social media content. If you're talking about a stock, if you're talking about a new announcement, whatever the case may be, you have to preserve that information. And FINRA has established some very specific do's and don'ts in the context of what you can do with social media. There are not many industries like that, and so organizations that are storing and sharing information with social media need to establish their own policies, and they need to treat social media just like any other electronic medium, whether it's files or email or anything else from which you retain content today. You need to do the same thing with social media. Now, we also found that inadequate archiving is a fairly risky proposition. For example, about a quarter of organizations we found in our recent research project have had to produce content for eDiscovery from their enterprise social media platform. And there really are a large and growing number of obligations to retain business records in social media. Again, as I mentioned, FINRA, but also other industries are following suit with regulations to retain information that's shared with social media, and also just a number of legal cases that are out there that make the retention of information on a long-term basis from social media feeds a very important issue. Also, corporate content or corporate context can be lost through social media. For example, if your employees maintain a LinkedIn profile of corporate clients, business contacts of various types, does the data in that LinkedIn profile belong to the employee who's gathering that information, or does it belong to their employer? And as you can see here in the case of Eagle versus Morgan, the court ruled that a LinkedIn profile, including all of the contacts that employee might have collected, belongs to the employee if the employer hasn't established any sort of social media policy specifically stating otherwise. And so again, going back to the need for a well thought out policy around social media, if you as an employer want to be able to retain those contacts and not have them leave when your employees leave, then you need to have a good social media policy that specifically states who owns what. And this applies to all social media properties, not just LinkedIn. The followers on Twitter, for example, do they belong to the employee or the employer? That's a critical issue that you're going to have to answer, because a lot of your business contacts and a lot of your expertise can leave when that employee leaves. Also, social media can be a very good ingress point for malware. As I mentioned earlier, short URLs, maybe in a Twitter feed or a Facebook post, the creation of bogus Facebook pages, such as on Facebook. There can be targeting by state-sponsored actors, and there have been a few examples of that. Malvertising, which is a really serious problem on Facebook and some other social media properties, can lead to the infiltration of malware simply by employees clicking on an advertisement in Facebook. And lack of monitoring is really a very common problem. What we found in our research, and because most companies today aren't doing any sort of monitoring. They're not looking at what their employees are doing on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn or literally the 1,000 other social media properties out there. And so there's lots of potential malware infiltration and potential for data loss simply because organizations aren't monitoring what's going on in their own networks. So I won't go through all of these, but there have been a number of important cases in the context of social media and litigation. For example, as you can see here in the first case in DOH versus Lake Central School Corporation, the plaintiff had deleted relevant information from his Facebook account, and the court found that that deletion constituted spoliation of evidence, just like if they had done it from email, or if they had deleted files, or if they had burned paper documents and so forth. Social media has been found to be a very important avenue for the retention of electronic information. The next case, Hannah versus Northeastern State University. A couple of professors posted racist comments on Facebook about a department chair that was denied tenure. The chair sued the university, claiming a hostile work environment, and the court found there to be a causal connection between the tenure issue and the plaintiff's complaints about race discrimination. So again, social media was used here in a very inappropriate way, and the organization that had hired the employees that had committed those acts were held accountable for it. And I won't go through the rest of the cases here, but you can do a search on Westlaw or any other good legal platform and find case after case after case where social media has been cited, where a court has said you need to retain records in Facebook, you need to bring up posts from Twitter, you need to retain information for long periods, just like you would in any other electronic medium. And we've had retention of records in email, for example, for well over a decade. It's been a best practice for at least 15 years. And this is becoming true as well in social media. You absolutely have to preserve the content that you generate and store in social media, because it might be required for e-discovery, it might be required during a regulatory audit and so forth, and you simply cannot shirk your responsibility to retain this information on a long-term basis. So in terms of best practices, there are several that we recommend. First, you need to establish policies about social media that can and cannot be used at work. And before you implement any technology for retention or malware prevention, what have you, you need to establish those policies. Really get a good handle on what you're going to allow employees to do and what you're not going to allow them to do. You need to establish rules about whether or not employees can speak on behalf of the company using social media. For example, are you going to allow employees to say anything about your company on Twitter, to post anything on Facebook, to even have a LinkedIn account that they use on a corporate network? You need to be very specific about what you're going to allow employees to do, and maybe establish only certain roles that are allowed to speak via social media on behalf of the company. You need to establish rules about the type of content that can be shared, whether it's press releases or information about the company or just offhand remarks about what's going on within your company. You need to be very specific about what you're going to allow to be shared. You need to establish rules about the use of personal accounts for work purposes. If somebody has their own Facebook account, are you going to allow them to use it for work, even if it provides a lot of utility, but potentially creates a lot of risk? You have to balance that out and establish a good policy about what you're going to allow. And then finally, you need to establish really good policies about succession planning. Who owns the Twitter contacts for each employee when they're using a corporate Twitter account at work? Who owns the content in Facebook when employees are tweeting it or posting about work-related issues and so forth? You need to have really good succession planning so that if an employee leaves your company, you know specifically what you're going to do in the context of ownership of all of that information. You also need to determine in that context who owns the social media contacts. And things are going to vary country to country, even state to state. There are differences in state rules about employee rights, and you need to really understand that by getting together with legal counsel, maybe talking with regulators and so forth about who specifically owns the social media contacts that your employees manage. You need to really understand how social media is used in your organization. Is it used just as an aside, or is it a critical part of the way that your company is communicating with prospects and clients? Because you don't want to have a draconian policy that says we're afraid of social media, we're going to cut all of it out. You need to understand how it's used so that you're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Then you need to understand how and really determine how data breaches are going to be handled. If something bad happens on social media, if information is shared inadvertently, an embargoed press release goes out too early, or somebody says something dumb on Facebook, you need to manage how that data breach is going to be handled and have the process in place before the problem occurs so that you don't have to scramble to understand how you're going to deal with it. And you need to implement very, very good user training. This is not only, from the perspective of what you're allowed to share and what you're not allowed to share, but also, best practices around clicking on Facebook ads or looking at content that maybe employees shouldn't be looking at, or, doing anything on social media. You need to have really good user training, and it needs to be kept up on a regular basis so that employees are up to speed on what their employer expects and the dangers of careless social media use. And then finally, you need to deploy solutions that are going to monitor social media use. You need to understand what's going on in your organization in as close to real time as possible so that you can address problems that come up very quickly. You need solutions that are going to be scanning for malware so that you can address problems very quickly so that you can stop malware from spreading in the organization and so forth. Because we find, for example, that phishing and ransomware are most common in email, but they can also occur in social media like Twitter and Facebook and other social media properties. And as time goes by, cyber criminals are going to be using social media more to distribute these phishing attempts and potentially distribute ransomware as well. You need to look for a solution and deploy one that will archive your social media content. This is absolutely critical. And you need to have social media archived in the right way, in its context, in the context of the conversations, and so forth. And then finally, we recommend deploying an enterprise social media solution. If you're going to have social media at all, you should have also an enterprise social media solution that's going to make your employees more efficient, that's going to allow them to share information more effectively, and that's going to potentially act as a substitute for email where that needs to occur. Now, we're not saying that social media is going to completely replace email. We don't think that's going to happen. But for certain types of activities, like collaboration activities, document sharing, and so forth, that today occur in email, that really can be better served by a good enterprise social media solution. Okay, and that concludes my part of the presentation. And Q, I'd like to hand things back to you now.
Great. Wonderful presentation. Thanks, Michael, for the information. One thing just to make everyone aware of, Michael touched on the sample social media touched on the social media policy. We actually have a sample social media policy, just kind of a guideline that might help you get started. I'll go ahead and put that through in the chat if everyone wants to take a look at that. Feel free to go out to that page and check it out and see what, it's kind of a template to help you get started on your social media policy if you don't have one. And then just to finish up, just as a reminder to everyone on this call, if you weren't aware, we here at Guava do have a social media archiving solution with Retained Social. This solution actually allows you to monitor and archive social media. And what's great about the solution is it actually captures all the data formats that you would have in your social media, meaning pictures, videos, GIFs, etc., and it captures them in their context, in their original state, so that when you go back and want to search that, you can easily get to it. With the monitoring piece, there's actually a part of Retained Social that allows you to have alerts for keywords, questions, and personal identifiable info. So as an example, if you have somebody who goes to your corporate social account and they ask a question to your company, Retained Social will alert you of that question so that you can quickly answer it. Also, if there's certain keywords that you don't want your employees pushing out there, Retained Social will alert you of those phrases or keywords that you have. The other nice thing about Retained Social is you can connect the social media accounts that you need to without having to have the login info, allowing this to be something seamless to where you don't have to take credentials from people. They can just authenticate. You send them a link, they authenticate their social media to Retained Social, and it will now archive. And then this also works on and off the network. And as you can see here on the screen, these are some of the platforms that Retained Social supports, and the archiving is done through a partnership that we have with Archive Social. And so now, we have that offering for you to be able to archive and monitor your social media. If you're interested in that, feel free to visit us at guava.com, and we can be sure to schedule a demo or get you pricing on how that would work. And of course, Retain Social is part of the bigger piece of Retain Unified Archiving. Retain Unified Archiving, as we talked about, archives social media. It also archives mobile communication and email communication, and all of that information is archived into one central location. So we do have time right now for some questions. If anyone has questions, feel free to put those through. It looks like we had one or two here. One of the questions that came through is, can we archive, and this is to you, Michael, is can we archive something as personal as social media?
Yeah, that becomes a real issue because if somebody is using a personal account, that becomes a very difficult issue. Generally, I think in the United States, and I'm not a lawyer and so can't offer any legal advice, but generally in the United States, if somebody is using a personal social media account on a corporate network, I think the employer is probably free to retain all of that content because it is passing over their network. In other countries, that probably is not the case, and certainly you need to get with legal counsel to determine what your rights are as an employer in that case. Generally, I think you're on decent legal ground if you retain information that's passing through your network, but probably not otherwise.
Great, awesome. And then if you could touch, I know you touched on some case law. Some people had asked what regulations could affect what I archive when it comes to social media, if there are regulations that actually touch on that.
Well, it depends to a large extent on the industry you're in. As I mentioned, the financial services industry has some very specific regulations about social media archiving, that have been promulgated by FINRA. They came out with a document back in 2010 that basically said we're not going to establish a new policy for social media because these are just electronic bits, and we're going to apply the same standard that we have to email and instant messaging. They did email back in 1997, instant messaging, I believe, in 2003. And they said, for social media, it's just part and parcel of the same. So if it contains a business record related to your business and you would store it in email or instant messaging, retain it even if it's in social media. Now, most other industries aren't quite as advanced as that, but if you're retaining electronic records of any kind, you should also be retaining social media. It's just one example. If you're faced, let's say, with a wrongful termination suit, part of your defense or part of the plaintiff's opposition may be content in social media, maybe things that the terminated employee was told via social media, and so you need to retain that information, both for your defense and also just to maybe do early case assessments. And so it's important, even if you don't have specific regulations that say you have to store certain types of information. If it's electronic, if it relates to your business, and if you're going to need it at some point in the future, it simply makes sense to retain it in a good archiving platform.
Okay, great. That looks like all the questions we have. Once again, everyone, thanks for being here and for your participation, and thanks again, Michael, for the presentation.
Thank you as well.
And once again, look for this recording. We'll be sending this out to everyone who is on this call. And thanks again. We hope to see you on the next one.